Before we begin the video, if you've been getting value out of this channel, please consider supporting High Americana via Patreon, linked in the description. At $3,000 a month, you will help me make this a full-time job and can also request historical content to be made. Thank you. And now, a passage from The Frontier in American History by Frederick Jackson Turner from Chapter 2, The First Official Frontier of the Massachusetts Bay. In The Significance of the Frontier in American History, I took for my text the following announcement of the Superintendent of the Census of 1890. Up to and including 1880, the country had a frontier of settlement, but at present the unsettled area has been so broken into by isolated bodies of settlement that there can hardly be said to be a frontier line. In the discussion of its extent, the westward movement, etc., it cannot therefore any longer have a place in the census reports. 2 centuries prior to this announcement, in 1690, a committee of the General Court of Massachusetts recommended the court to order what shall be the frontier, and to maintain a committee to settle garrisons on the frontier with 40 soldiers to each frontier town as a main guard. In the 200 years between this official attempt to locate the Massachusetts frontier line and the official announcement of the ending of the national frontier line, westward expansion was the most important single process in American history. The designation frontier town was not, however, a new one. As early as 1645, inhabitants of Concord, Sudbury, and Dedham, being inland towns and but thinly peopled, were forbidden to remove without authority. In 1669, certain towns had been the subject of legislation as frontier towns, and in the period of King Philip's War, there were various enactments regarding frontier towns. In the session of 1675-6, it had been proposed to build a fence of stockades or stone 8 feet high from the Charles, where it is navigable, to the Concord at Billerica, and thence to the Merrimack and down the river to the bay, by which means that whole tract will be environed for the security and safety under God of the people, their houses, goods, and cattle, from the rage and fury of the enemy. This project, however, of a kind of Roman wall, did not appeal to the frontiersmen of the time. It was a part of the antiquated ideas of defense which had been illustrated by the impossible equipment of the heavily armored soldier of the early Puritan regime, whose corselets and headpieces, pikes, matchlocks, forquets, and bandoliers went out of use about the period of King Philip's War. The 57 postures provided in the approved manual of arms for loading and firing the matchlock proved too great a handicap in the chase of the nimble savage. In this era, the frontier fighter adapted himself to a more open order and lighter equipment suggested by the Indian warrior's practice. The settlers on the outskirts of Puritan civilization took up the task of bearing the brunt of attack and pushing forward the line of advance which year after year carried American settlements into the wilderness. In American thought and speech, the term frontier has come to mean the edge of settlement rather than, as in Europe, the political boundary. By 1690, it was already evident that the frontier of settlement and the frontier of military defense were coinciding. As population advanced into the wilderness and thus successively brought new exposed areas between the settlements on the one side and the Indians with their European backers on the other, the military frontier ceased to be thought of as the Atlantic coast, but rather as a moving line bounding the unwon wilderness. It could not be a fortified boundary along the charter limits, for those limits extended to the South Sea and conflicted with the bounds of sister colonies. The thing to be defended was the outer edge of this expanding society, a changing frontier, one that needed designation and restatement with the changing location of the West. It will help to illustrate the significance of this new frontier when we see that Virginia, at about the same time as Massachusetts, underwent a similar change and attempted to establish frontier towns or cohabitations at the heads, that is, the first falls, the vicinity of Richmond, Petersburg, etc., of her rivers. The Virginia system of particular plantations introduced along the James at the close of the London Company's activity had furnished a type for the New England town. In recompense, at this later day, the New England town may have furnished a model for Virginia's efforts to create frontier settlements by legislation. An act of March 12, 1694-5, by the General Court of Massachusetts enumerated the frontier towns which the inhabitants were forbidden to desert on pain of loss of their lands, if landholders, or of imprisonment, if not landholders, unless permission to remove were first obtained. These 11 frontier towns included Wells, York, and Kittery on the eastern frontier, and Amesbury, Haverhill, Dunstable, Chelmsford, Groton, Lancaster, Marlborough, and Deerfield. In March 1699 to 1700, the law was reenacted with the addition of Brookfield, Mendon, and Woodstock, together with 7 others: Salisbury, Andover, Billerica, Hatfield, Hadley, Westfield, and Northampton, which, though they be not frontiers as those towns first named, yet lie more open than many others to an attack of an enemy. In the spring of 1704, the General Court of Connecticut, following closely the Act of Massachusetts, named as her frontier towns not to be deserted Simsbury, Waterbury, Danbury, Colchester, Wyndham, Mansfield, and Plainfield. Thus, about the close of the 17th and the beginning of the 18th century, there was an officially designated frontier line for New England. The line passing through these enumerated towns represents 1. The outskirts of settlement along the eastern coast and up the Merrimack and its tributaries, a region threatened from the Indian country by way of the Winnipesaukee Lake. 2. The end of the ribbon of settlement up the Connecticut Valley menaced by the Canadian Indians by way of the Lake Champlain and Winooski River route to the Connecticut. 3. Boundary towns which marked the edges of that inferior agricultural region, where the hard crystalline rocks furnished a later foundation for Shays' rebellion, opposition to the adoption of the federal Constitution, and the abandoned farm, and 4. The isolated intervale of Brookfield, which lay intermediate between these frontiers. Besides this New England frontier, there was a belt of settlement in New York, ascending the Hudson to where Albany and Schenectady served as outposts against the Five Nations who menaced the Mohawk, and against the French and the Canadian Indians who threatened the Hudson by way of Lake Champlain and Lake George. The sinister relations of leading citizens of Albany engaged in the fur trade with these Indians, even during time of war, tended to protect the Hudson River frontier at the expense of the frontier towns of New England. The common sequence of frontier types, fur trader, cattle-raising pioneer, small primitive farmer, and the farmer, engaged in intensive, varied agriculture to produce a surplus for export, had appeared, though confusedly, in New England. The traders and their posts had prepared the way for the frontier towns, and the cattle industry was most important to the early farmers. But the stages succeeded rapidly and intermingled. After King Philip's War, while Albany was still in the fur-trading stage, the New England frontier towns were rather like Mark colonies, military agricultural outposts against the Indian enemy. The story of the border warfare between Canada and the frontier towns furnishes ample material for studying frontier life and institutions, but I shall not attempt to deal with the narrative of the wars. The palisaded meeting house square, the fortified isolated garrison house, the massacres and captivities are familiar features of New England's history. The Indian was a very real influence upon the mind and morals as well as upon the institutions of frontier New England. The occasional instances of Puritans returning from captivity to visit the frontier towns, Catholic in religion, painted and garbed as Indians and speaking the Indian tongue, and the half-breed children of captive Puritan mothers, tell a sensational part of the story, but in the normal as well as in such exceptional relations of the frontier townsmen to the Indians, there are clear evidences of the transforming influence of the Indian frontier upon the Puritan type of English colonist. In 1703-4, for example, the General Court of Massachusetts ordered 500 pairs of snowshoes and an equal number of moccasins for use in specified counties lying frontier next to the wilderness. Connecticut, in 1704, after referring to her frontier towns and garrisons, ordered that said company of English and Indians shall from time to time, at the discretion of their chief commander, range the woods to endeavor the discovery of an approaching enemy, and in a special manner from Westfield to Wustanook. And for the encouragement of our forces gone or going against the enemy, this court will allow out of the public treasury the sum of £5 for every man's scalp of the enemy killed in this colony. Massachusetts offered bounties for scalps varying in amount, according to whether the scalp was of men or women and youths, and whether it was taken by regular forces under pay, volunteers in service, or volunteers without pay. One of the most striking phases of frontier adjustment was the proposal of the Reverend Solomon Stoddard of Northampton in the fall of 1703, urging the use of dogs to hunt Indians as they do bears. The argument was that the dogs would catch many an Indian who would be too light of foot for the townsmen, nor was it to be thought of as inhuman, for the Indians act like wolves and are to be dealt with as wolves. In fact, Massachusetts passed an act in 1706 for the raising and increasing of dogs for the better security of the frontiers, and both Massachusetts and Connecticut in 1708 paid money from their treasury for the trailing of dogs. Thus we come to familiar ground. The Massachusetts frontiersman, like his western successor, hated the Indians. The tawny serpents, of Cotton Mather's phrase, were to be hunted down and scalped in accord with law, and in at least one instance by the chaplain himself, a Harvard graduate, the hero of the Ballad of Pigwacket, who many Indians slew, and some of them he scalped when bullets round him flew. Within the area bounded by the frontier line were the broken fragments of Indians defeated in the era of King Philip's War, restrained within reservations, drunken and degenerate survivors, among whom the missionaries worked with small results, a vexation to the border towns as they were in the case of later frontiers. Although, as has been said, the frontier towns had scattered garrison houses and palisaded enclosures similar to the neighborhood forts or stations of Kentucky in the Revolution and of Indiana and Illinois in the War of 1812, one difference is particularly noteworthy. In the case of frontiersmen who came down from Pennsylvania into the upland South along the eastern edge of the Alleghanies, as well as in the more obvious case of the backwoodsmen of Kentucky and Tennessee, the frontier towns were too isolated from the main settled regions to allow much military protection by the older areas. On the New England frontier, because it was adjacent to the coast towns, this was not the case, and here, as in 17th century Virginia, great activity in protecting the frontier was evinced by the colonial authorities, and the frontier towns themselves called loudly for assistance. This phase of frontier defense needs a special study, but at present it is sufficient to recall that the colony sent garrisons to the frontier besides using the militia of the frontier towns, and that it employed rangers to patrol from garrison to garrison. These were prototypes of the regular army post, and of rangers, dragoons, cavalry, and mounted police who have carried the remoter military frontier forward. It is possible to trace this military cordon from New England to the Carolinas early in the 18th century, still neighboring the coast. By 1840 it ran from Fort Snelling on the upper Mississippi through various posts to the Sabine boundary of Texas, and so it passed forward until today it lies at the edge of Mexico and the Pacific Ocean.